Hi, we all know producers, directors, production companies call FX6 owners when they have to shoot in low light. And for good reason. I mean, the second base ISO is 12,800. Even if it's not as clean as ISO 800, it's 12,800. Sometimes I even have to use some ND because it's too bright, which was a new concept to get used to. So I did a quick comparison, and I also added the Blackmagic 6K to the mix with some interesting results in my opinion. Now, long story short, for the people who don't want to watch the whole video, the reason for shooting S-Cinetone versus S-Log3 doesn't change from a normal daylight situation. If you have the option to shoot S-Log3, you should, because it has a higher dynamic range and more flexibility in post. But when you have to hand off your footage to an editor that won't color grade, or even a client, then please shoot in S-Cinetone, because there is nothing worse than seeing your gray footage appear online. But now let's dig a little deeper and see why. Firstly, it really amazed me how much the FX6 actually sees at 12,800. I mean, I quickly checked 800 and I was amazed. But let's start at 10%. Both S-Log3 and S-Cinetone are underexposed. So I brought them both up to get a more realistic image. We immediately see the difference in dynamic range and therefore in contrast. Even though the image of S-Cinetone is much darker, after an equal amount of exposure change, we see that the highlights on the skin is already clipping. Which technically we could bring back in post, but then what's the purpose of shooting S-Cinetone? I would suggest not going over ISO 10,000 or 6 dB of gain, because it starts to introduce quite a bit of noise, even with the noise suppression setting set too high. And so it again loses its advantage over shooting S-Log3. And this trend of lower dynamic range and similar noise levels continues with the light at 50% and at 100%. With the light at 50%, S-Log3 is starting to look great in my opinion. There is a bit of noise in the shadows, but it's not distracting, and when I walk close to the light source, my skin is not clipping. With Cinetone, it's a whole different story. The overall image is still appearing quite dark, and when I go and stand right next to the light source, my skin is already clipping. Which could be avoided by shooting at -3 dB of gain or ISO 5000, but well, then the image is much darker. With the light at 100%, which sounds a lot, but it's still just a small RGB light, both are looking very clean. S-Cinetone is finally at a good exposure, but stay away from the light sources because now the skin is clipping beyond saving. This is the same for S-Log3, but with a bit of work I think it's still savable. After my tests in the garage, I quickly went out and put my results to the test. I also took my Blackmagic to see how it would compare to the FX6. Overall, as said, S-Log3 is giving me by far the best results, but it also reminded me how important exposure and white balance is, because it's much less forgiving in low light than in normal circumstances. So there were a few shots where I actually preferred the S-Cinetone over S-Log3, but that's definitely user error, because I had to pull it too much in post. But I did notice something weird happening with the yellows and giving me some dirty colors. I don't know if it translates well on YouTube. Then adding the Pocket 6K to the mix, I was actually quite surprised how clean it is at ISO 3200, which is its second base ISO, because after all the footage is still raw without any noise suppression. At ISO 3200, it's not as clean as the FX6, and the blacks appear to be clipping a bit faster, but it's definitely usable. I would compare the dynamic range a bit to S-Cinetone. As it also shoots at ISO 12800, I wanted to give it a try. And let's leave that one as a worst case scenario, because even with noise reduction applied in post, the noise is still quite distracting. What I did notice with the Pocket is that once you go over ISO 6400, you do not have the possibility to change the ISO in post. When I'm shooting in low light, I'm just looking for a realistic image, and that's what the FX6 with S-Log 3 delivers. I would suggest to overexpose about one stop, so then you get those clean skin tones with shadows that have a bit of noise, but it's not distracting and to me even organic looking. Okay, you might be saying you're overexposing, but can I remind you we're shooting at ISO 12800. But of course there will be moments where you have to shoot S-Cinetone, and there my suggestion is to stay within the range of -3 dB to 3 dB of gain, which translates to ISO 5000 to 10,000. But more importantly, make sure you bring a big monitor. You have to see exactly what you're shooting, because with S-Cinetone, what you're shooting is what you're getting in post without much flexibility. How the f do you end the video? So I hope that was helpful in some kind of way, but if you have any other questions, let me know in the comments and I'll maybe be able to answer them. Ciao!